Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Gulsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
Well, I've just come to the realization lately that you were built for podcasting.
Well, I definitely am built for it. You know, the problem that I have when I listen back to me, I don't understand why people want to listen to me. I understand why they want to look at me, but listen to me. That's a different thing. So
you've got a soothing voice, but that's actually not the primary reason I said that you're built for podcasting.
Oh,
you want
really?
to take another guess?
No, I'm gonna let you lay it out there.
Well, I feel like
lay it on me.
I feel like every time we record, I eat 2 times to your every one, and I go to the bathroom 2 times to your every 1 bathroom trip. You just go through these
I'm
episodes.
A tank, buddy.
You are. It's like a camel, man. You're like a camel. Yeah. You just keep going, and it was funny. It was nice because we just recently recorded, that episode with Bronson Strickland and Steve Damaris talking about how deer and turkey management, share some things in common and other things that they don't. And as Bronson was signing off, he was talking about his stomach rumbling, and I'm like, finally, somebody who gets me.
I was thinking, I got like 6 more hours before
I know. But on days that we record now, I've had to start planning around that, and I'm like, I got to have something like within arm's reach to eat because Marcus waits for no one to eat.
Yeah, I'm going hardcore. There's a word for what I experience in that. I think it's called the zone.
Oh,
I get in the zone, and food is not part of that zone.
I need to get me one of those.
Yeah.
A zone.
Yeah, you gotta get in the zone, and when you can eliminate the need for unnecessary things like food and water from that zone, it's a pretty convenient space to live in.
I think the only zone I've ever gotten into is an auto zone.
I was in one of those recently.
Not where you want to be.
Yeah. Yep, there are no turkeys in there. Most of the time.
Maybe a few squirrels.
Yeah. Well, this batch of episodes, I hope folks agree. I think those guys, they are extraordinarily intelligent guys.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me a minute going back through that stuff. It was a lot of content to go through, but it took me a lot of time to really think through, what they're talking about and trying to understand it. Chip Wood talking about some of those models, I don't understand them. I kind of understand what goes into them and why and what the importance is.
Yeah.
But man, some of that stuff got pretty deep pretty quick.
Yeah. And so I would say I totally agree with you, Marcus. It was heavy listening for me too. I listened to all 3 episodes back to back last week in the office one day when I was taking notes on them.
Mm-hmm.
And if this is, some of the first material that you've ever listened to with us, I'll share that that's about as deep as we go. We try to keep this pretty topical and easily digestible by turkey hunters and turkey managers. But I had some difficulty hanging with these guys too during certain parts of the discussion. It was heavy material, but good and relevant to this conversation.
Yeah. And I don't think that is a knock on those guys either. Like, I think they were kind of teetering on that, being able to communicate science to the general public that's not thinking about that stuff, because I think I'm very close to that seam.
Yeah.
where I can understand the science and usually deliver it pretty well to people who are not thinking about it a lot.
But I'm not a
But we
quantitative ecologist.
right, but we also asked them to be there.
Yes.
You know that those guys are really great communicators, and I have heard them break things down to, bring it down where the goats could eat it, so to speak, uh, like we were told to do. But yeah, I think that we need that. We needed
Mhm.
them to really go in it and go through the details. So, with that being said, I just wanted to go ahead and lay it out there for you. Where did that put you on density dependence?
I don't know. I don't know where it put me on density dependence. But related to that, one thing that Mark said that really resonated with me is that populations can't increase forever.
Yeah,
And if there's a better argument for density dependence being a thing, I'm not aware of it.
yeah. No, I think that it's the same thing. It could go the opposite way. If you get down to one turkey, there's not going to be no more turkeys,
Right.
right? Which is the opposite extreme of that. But uh, yeah, I agree. In terms of it being a principle, like I'm unwavered.
Yeah.
Uh, I thought that was really interesting in the conversation, though, thinking about how operational is it,
Mhm.
and I thought Brett made some good points about this in his episode about, and I'm with him 100%. It doesn't matter if it's density dependence if there isn't uh, some actionable
Yeah.
knowledge that's coming from it.
Yeah. I think he really emphasized that it's important to understand, I guess, as wildlife scientists, it's important for us to understand the concept of density dependence. But what is most important from a management perspective is to understand the mechanisms
Hmm.
involved in that density dependent relationship. Because until we identify those mechanisms and what influences them, we can't do anything about it.
Yeah, yeah, I agree, and I think that's the important part. But I was thinking about it a little differently, I guess, and I still am, and I may have even been strengthened in this. That I think understanding if it is dense, if what we're seeing in turkey populations is a reflection of density dependent mechanisms, that
Mhm.
itself is important information
Mhm.
because then we know that like, for instance, if it's a resource, like seeing a population decline in a density dependent manner indicates to us that we need to look at resources,
Mhm.
right?
It indicates that a factor or one or more factors has
Yeah,
become
something
limiting.
exactly. And
There's
I
not
think
enough.
that's where I am with that is that that's really critical. If a population is increasing and you're not seeing that commensurate decrease in reproductive success, then it tells me that the other stuff is not
Mhm.
limiting the population and you're doing what you need to be successful.
Right. Yeah.
And that could also be in a stable population as long as you're not seeing that negative relationship. I think Brett was the one that articulate, or I can't remember who articulated it directly, but that actually I think it was Mark, that negative relationship between the reproductive measure or whatever your metric of population fitness is, uh, if that has a negative relationship with the population trajectory, that's what's really important, and it's telling us, you know, okay, as the population grows, uh, egg laying or poult success or whatever is declining.
Mhm.
As it increases, that's a pretty important thing for me. What metric is acting on it is the next step.
Yeah.
Then you know to look for it.
What's running out?
Right. And that's where I think Brett was, is that it's really important for us to take that next step and understand what is going on. and then being able to address it with some sort of corrective action.
Sure.
That's where the
Yeah.
rubber meets the road.
And one of the other things that he said that really hit home for me, because it's something that you and I have discussed a lot, maybe on this podcast, but definitely outside of it, is that as wildlife science progresses, not just only on the subject matter of turkeys, but in general, we're at a point in time where we need to ask more difficult questions.
Mhm.
And he went on further to specify that we need to be looking more at cause and effect instead of just doing, purely observational study
Yeah.
to elucidate, identify these mechanisms that are affecting population growth rates.
I cannot agree more with that, and I think that is reflective on all of our dialogue, in other episodes of this that, and it will be common that we really need to address some things, first of all, experimentally. I think that is one weakness just in wildlife
Hmm.
biology in general, and it's really hard. But it allows you to isolate things. One thing that became evident to me after going through this with these guys, we do a lot of borrowing. We're
Hmm.
borrowing information from other species literature a lot for
Yeah.
turkeys,
Yeah.
and I think that has been evident. Uh, so I think those points are really really important, and we need to do a better job of that. The other point, one of the reasons it's so difficult, also that we haven't spent much time on, is we've kind of been operating in these independent hypotheses realms.
Hmm.
And the fact of the matter is, all kinds of things have changed. And to think that they're not all contributing, there's a possibility that every hypothesis we've gone through to explain declines are all contributing to the decline.
I don't think there's just a possibility. I think it's a certainty.
Yeah.
I think there's a certainty that disease is affecting populations to some extent, as are feral pigs, as are hunter harvest, as is habitat, and on down the list. The question, and this is something that I've been using a lot every time I talk about turkeys, and I've probably mentioned it several times on this podcast, but it is that we need to identify the effect size, the relative contribution of each of those factors to population negative population growth that we're seeing, so that we can start to prioritize those for management.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you on that. Another aspect of that is we're trying to explain why have we seen such consistent
Yeah,
patterns across all these places.
right. And that's one of the
And
things that I think has caused you and I to both gravitate towards this,
yeah,
the
what
density
like
dependent hypothesis.
right. But I think it's important to realize, and Brett made it very clear he doesn't want it to be Brett's hypothesis, but he articulated an alternative hypothesis that is different from what we've already covered to explain this regional decline.
Hmm.
And I wanted to talk to you about it directly a little bit right here. We talked about the season frameworks and the timing of
Hmm.
harvest.
Right.
And if you remember, we also, when we talked to Adam Butler, one of the things we keyed in on and followed in our follow up episode as well was that they moved the season dates, but it did not actually decrease the harvest. It just changed the timing of the harvest.
Hmm.
And I don't think they have the comparable information from the Tennessee experiment, but and also I'm not familiar with how it has influenced statewide harvest in states that have moved their season either. But based on the Mississippi information, we are potentially isolating the timing from the overall pressure.
Hmm.
And I think one of the things that Brett that I got from it is that the increase in pressure, just total number of gobblers being harvested, not the timing, but just the total number of gobblers being harvested, is another potential issue that we need to address, a competing hypothesis, if you will, that is confounded with other factors like the density dependence hypothesis related to when they were stocked and when they have kind of reached that peak. I can see where he's coming from when he was talking about that, and that it's probably reasonable for us to explore that independent of the timing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, they're not fully independent because the timing doesn't matter if it's a quarter of a percent of the gobblers being harvested. Like those things have to be interacting, and everybody that we've talked to so far, I think, has agreed that if you're killing 80% of the gobblers, that's probably bad. It doesn't matter when it is, even.
Yeah.
Uh, so they're definitely intertwined, but there's a lot of opportunity to isolate those two factors and realize, you know, is it are either of them important, and if so, what is their relative importance? And that also makes a big difference in how you change, like seasons, or what you did with the hunting to try to address it. That makes a big difference.
Yeah. And to just kind of as a thought experiment to think about how that information might be enacted on the ground is, if we find out that there's an allowable harvest of, let's just say, 10% of the male population before peak onset of nesting, then we could potentially use regulations to meter that out, or maybe,
Mhm.
set up a quota on a wildlife management area where we have our known estimated population and we, calculate 10% of that. And then as soon as that 10% is hit, they shut down hunting on that site until most of the hens are in the active incubation phase. So we
Mhm.
still get to hunt early. There's we haven't decreased opportunity as much, but we're not interfering as much with reproduction.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good point. Another, as a scientist, I'm immediately like, okay, well, how do we isolate those in an experimental framework so
Yeah,
that we can actually see?
yeah,
And then
that's
yeah,
the
go ahead.
rub, right? I mean, when you start talking about experimentally killing birds, or even if you're using hunters to experimentally kill birds, um, many hunters rely solely on public land to turkey hunt, and they have a long-standing tradition of probably hunting the public land closest to their house. So if they have one WMA, us as research scientists, we're looking at it, oh, this is only a few years that we're going to be playing around some with season dates or bag limits or something like that. That has a profound impact on them.
Yeah,
S-
it's a few individuals where they're really being impacted.
yeah,
Whereas on average, it's not. Let's say in the state of Alabama, if you did that on two of them,
yeah,
on average, it's not impacting the hunting community that much, but it's disproportionately impacting relatively few of the
yeah,
hunters on those
right,
particular areas. So, yeah, that's a good point. I was thinking back, some of the turkey work that we're starting on Osceolas, I have a prime opportunity to get at this question in a different way, particularly with the number of birds. We just don't have the funding currently to do that, but we have a lot of areas where they are public hunting or private hunting in a large land holding, and then directly adjacent or just down the road, there's a paired area that's a park or something like
hmm
that where there are tons of turkeys and there's no hunting.
hmm
And that, when I think about that, I know we have the opportunity here. I just haven't been able to fund it yet to do it, but that would give us really good information on it. It's kind of remarkable to me that we haven't done more work like that.
yeah,
Mike Chamberlain talked about it some from the South Carolina study, but again, that, as far as I understand, is one area that's hunted and one that's not,
yeah,
that are adjacent. But that's something that could be really important. It's really hard to get funded by a state agency because they are catering to hunters, and they're probably not going to want to spend half of their money on a place that hunting is not occurring.
yeah,
But that would be, it seems like a really good way that we could set up an experimental design to get at the hunter harvest aspect, if it is actually just number of birds being taken, you could just compare populations and replicate it
Yeah.
uh, relatively easily
Well, that would be
by
the key,
having
right? Is
paired areas.
is
Yeah.
the replication aspect, because one of the drawbacks that you do run into from an experimental design framework when you've got paired hunted and unhunted sites is you can do your best to make sure that they're as similar in all other conditions aside from the hunting aspect. Excuse me. But there's always going to be some minor differences there, and that's where the replication comes into
Hmm.
play. So, the question then becomes, how many pairs of hunted and unhunted do we need? Do we need 5? Do we need 10?
Yeah.
I'm not really
That's
sure.
a good. I don't either. I think that's probably also depends, as we bring up all the time. But in the Florida study right now with some of the work, we have 5 pairs,
Yeah,
uh,
which is solid.
which we could have more than that. That's just how many we have right now identified for some of the other work. We are not planning to track hens and reproduction because of finance aspect
Mhm.
of it, but we are going to be able to do the song meter stuff on 5 pairs. I think is
Yeah.
what we ended up with,
And that's
and that's just one state, and within the range of one subspecies in that
yeah.
state that's pretty small. So
And that's somewhat analogous to the work that Mike and I have going on in Alabama right now, where he's
hmm
got the song meters out on wildlife management areas, and then I've got them out on some well managed private properties that have very low hunting pressure.
hmm
So it's not complete opposite ends of the spectrum, but they're still very different in regards to how they're hunted. And so
yeah.
that's allowing for some interesting, compare and contrast opportunities. But just like you, we don't have the funding available to actually look at those vital rates, those
hmm
demographic parameters on the
Right.
unhunted and the hunted sites. We're having to kind of rely on the gobbling activity as an index of that.
hmm Yeah, and there's plenty of issues just with that. Uh, well, and the other problem when you go in that scenario, I suspect the habitat management and things like that are probably starkly different as
Yeah,
well.
you start running into that issue as well. So there's compounding factors there for sure.
Yeah, and we may have some of those same issues in our study of design as well. But I know one of the pairs I've been on the property, and you would never know which one you're on, like in terms of habitat management, like they look the
Yeah,
same. But
yeah,
that certainly is not the case
right,
across the board.
right.
Um, if you go to a park in X state and compare that to nearby WMA, it is a pretty good chance they're going to look starkly different in terms of habitat
Right,
management as well.
right.
So, yeah, that's an interesting point. Uh, I have another one that I think ties in well with that. Is it interesting to you? And I'm thinking about the conversation with Chitwood and them building that really awesome modeling approach and looking at Lambda. He showed there's a decline, based on all that information, pointed out some problems with the data and all that sort of stuff. But one thing that just kind of struck me is, and you even asked him, I think, about it, and he said it was just females.
Mhm.
And then I was like, well, my experience with that kind of approach, when we're looking at population dynamics and things, it is very common that we don't even include males. Like they're not in the model.
Yeah.
They're irrelevant part of the population. And that was pretty interesting to me in the context that we're also talking about season frameworks and harvests and that being and
Mhm.
that aspect is usually not even included in population dynamics models.
Yeah.
So I didn't know if that resonated with you at all or if you thought about it, but
I
that
didn't.
that was interesting to me because we kind of, as a science, doing all these population stuff, we for a long time with a lot of species kind of ignored males. Are you aware of any times where we do include the males? I'm sure there are.
No, I mean, the only population models that I've ever been involved in are for deer and turkeys, and I don't. There's nothing published out there, despite how plausible it may be or how much we talk about the role of males in reproduction. There's no hard figures that show if you harvest a certain amount of males by this time or a certain amount of males overall that it impacts reproduction. We have no hard numbers on that
Mhm.
to actually plug into a model. And so despite, how much we may speculate about the role of males in all of this, until those data are available, I would ask, how do you include them?
Yeah. Well, you'd have to basically put what you think the impact is in there because it's not
Right.
been measured.
Yeah. And that's
So,
done sometimes.
yeah. But, we really want the data to back that kind of
Yeah.
parameter.
And that goes
But it's
back to
just
the experiments we were just discussing that would make those types of experiments would make that type of determination that could help refine that model.
and I think as far as I understand, both of them support that, we don't need them in the model.
Both of what support that.
Those 2 studies that we've covered that are ongoing,
Yes. Right.
neither found a reproductive consequence,
Right.
associated with it, which would mean that we can just not put it in there, which is consistent with a ton of work on a lot of species. But
Mhm.
I'm gonna dig into that farther. That was something I meant to do, and I dug in and have gotten really in the weeds on something else that has been sticking with me,
Mhm.
and, we'll get into that in a few minutes. But that's another thing that I really want to explore. We have a lot of brilliant scientists working on species all over the planet, and I'm gonna dig in and see if I can find examples where males are being used in population
Mhm.
demographic models. In
Right.
fact, one person who is, world globally respected for that kind of work is literally my next door neighbor in my office.
Well, there you go.
So I might ask him. He's worked on I don't even know how many species all over the world doing that kind of work, and
Mhm.
if that, you know, I think it'd be interesting for us to borrow a little more information and see, okay, in some circumstances, the male mortality or whatever is being incorporated in for these reasons, and let's see how that compares to what we should be thinking about with turkeys.
Right.
Because I suspect it would be in a circumstance like this where the males are really vulnerable during a time when they are important from
Mhm.
the population standpoint, like breeding with
Mhm.
turkeys could be.
And
And
that probably is why there aren't other species out there where males are incorporated into the model, because it's assumed that the males are not, suffering hunting mortality or some
right,
unnaturally high level of mortality during the reproductive
yeah.
season.
But you think about other like I'm thinking about the birds of paradise, for instance, where if you don't know what that is, go look up birds of
Yeah.
paradise. There's all these really wild looking birds, and they have these really elaborate characteristics, kind of like turkeys. Some of them are way more elaborate than
Mhm.
turkeys. And the idea is that they've been in a situation where there's not a consequence from a predation risk standpoint. And that trait has just been selected for more and more over time and gotten really elaborate because
Mhm.
there's not a consequence to the male.
Of showing off.
Right.
Yeah.
From a predator standpoint.
Right.
But in this case with turkeys, there's a consequence potentially
Yeah.
of showing off because of hunting, and so I can see where it could go in there,
Yeah.
but I just need to explore that more.
Yeah, I mean, his consequences if it's me hunting aren't that high. I mean, maybe they're a little bit higher for you, but
Well, not based on my recent past.
so
Uh,
so if I may, there was I'd like to bring up one other thing that really stood out to me from our conversations, and that was part of our conversation with Coulter, um, where he started talking about how little information there is out there on poult survival.
mhm,
And this was something that Mark McConnell brought up as well. And in particular, one thing that Coulter said that really stood out to me was that a lot of studies may be overemphasizing the importance of nest success and population growth because we don't have the corresponding data on poult survival.
mhm,
And if we did have that data, maybe we would find, oh, our bottleneck in this population is at that poult stage, not at that nest stage. It's easy to focus on the nest stage because we lose so many of them, and intuitively, that's something important for management to address, and it probably will remain true regardless of how much additional information we get on poults. But we need to know more about poults.
I agree. And that, one of us followed up with him and asked some questions about that and what's resonating with me. I was trying to figure out like, we understand we don't have that much data, but maybe where it's a little less intuitive is when we are trying to use the data. What is the difference in having one data point and many data points?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I was, trying to get out of him, or whoever asked the questions. I don't recall now. And I was trying to think through, okay, why is that? If we just had one metric of poult survival, what is that functionally changing in the way that we're doing it? And essentially, at that point, what would happen in that model is, well, you could do it in a lot of different ways. But one thing that could happen is that you basically have a simplifying assumption that you have a standardized poult survival, like it's just
Mm-hmm.
always this,
Mm-hmm.
and that we obviously know that can't be true.
Yeah.
Like, it's going to vary.
Yeah.
And that could be for lots of different reasons. And I think the Texas rainfall situation is showing us that that's not true. In that really dynamic environment with rainfall, you could go from nearly complete success to near failure just from year to year.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't really know what that full bound is in most of our eastern populations.
Right.
And that's definitely a problem.
Yeah. And if you don't have that high resolution data and the range of variation that poult
Hmm.
survival probably includes, then that could result in an analysis like they did, a sensitivity analysis in this case, pointing to another factor as being the primary one driving population growth, just because the poult survival couldn't rise to the top because there's not enough information there on it.
Hmm.
And as those gaps start to be filled in, it could be that something like poult survival raises to the top. And
Yeah.
then it switches over from us being so concerned about nest success rates and managing the habitat to maximize that success, and potentially even directly managing predator populations to impact that nest success, to switching to thinking more about brooding habitat and brood predators.
Hmm.
I'm not saying that's necessarily going to be the outcome, but just trying to go through a thought experiment of describing how that might change the picture.
Yeah. Well, we
And I'm
get
not,
enough
and I
information to
also,
realize that what we thought was the most important factor is actually not often
yeah,
the.
yeah, and I'm not
Yeah.
saying in that scenario that we would quit trying to maximize nest success at the same time, not at all. But
Mhm.
I think it just places greater priority on that poult period,
Yeah.
that brooding period.
Well, that I think, I think you're right, and the safe bet for us is to try to maximize all of those things at the same time,
Correct.
knowing something's gonna be limiting, and if you're addressing all of them, then you can address the limiting. Another thing that has kinda been sitting around festering with me as we talk about
That's a gross
nesting
word, by the
success.
way.
What's that?
Festering.
Festering? Should I use a different one?
Let's
Is there
go
a
with
different word?
ruminating.
That's more gross to me.
I mean, digestion versus infection.
Yeah. Yeah, neither are good options. We'll just
How about you just say something I've been thinking about?
something I've been thinking about. When I was a boy, uh, well, one thing that I think all 3 of them, but they were a couple of them in particular, extremely adamant that hen survival is absolutely critical, and they even
Mhm.
went to the extent to say we should not be shooting hens, and we're all competent enough to make that decision.
Mhm.
They went that far, but and then another conversation we had after the fact with Brett, which we're going to have him back on to talk about because I think it's absolutely critical that we do, and we can touch
Oh,
on that in a minute.
hell yes. I know where you're
Uh,
going.
yeah, yeah. See, that's one of the things that people aren't getting. We're having conversations before and after these,
Yeah.
the ones that are online, realizing, oh, we got to have you back to talk
Yeah.
about this other thing
Right.
because it completely changed my perspective again.
I know.
And this thing's like a damn emotional roller coaster. I don't know what to think, uh, which is good. I'm being challenged.
Yeah.
I'm consistently being challenged. But anyway, they all agreed hen is super important, right?
Right.
I mean, we're talking about a lifetime of success potential if that hen dies.
Yeah. I mean, we cry
It's
over one nest being raided or
yeah,
burned or mowed, but versus a hen is shot and that's all her nest in her lifetime.
yeah, which could be
Gone.
several years, and if she happened to be super hen, then that is potentially
Disproportionate impact.
yes, this huge impact on the population. I get that. Here's the part that kind of illuminated for me when I started kind of thinking about that.
Now there's a
See,
good word.
I didn't say those other words there.
There's a good word.
Yeah,
You illuminated my eyes when you use that word. And I think
illumination in the flatwoods,
that's
right there.
exactly what comes to mind.
You just read that book, didn't you?
I did.
Yeah, it's great, great. I need to go back to it. Uh, Now no, I didn't. I didn't forget. I was thinking I forgot where I did, but then I thought about it again. We've been really concerned about nest success, and then the experts are telling us hens are disproportionately important. And then it dawned on me, hens are disproportionately vulnerable to predation while nesting.
Mhm.
And that kind of was an epiphany. And everybody is out there probably like, well, of course. It's like, yeah, but we've been thinking about protecting the nest with all of our management actions and make sure there's high quality nesting cover for the nest. But really, it's probably more important, and based on all their ideas, it almost certainly is more important that we are focused on making sure that hen is not vulnerable to predation. The hell with the nest, so to speak.
Mhm.
Like the nesting
Yeah.
is important, obviously, and we focused on that, but really, a lot of hens are dying while they're nesting
Mhm.
or brooding. Uh, and I just haven't been thinking about it that way.
Yeah. And then and then
That's she's super vulnerable, and we really need to be thinking about how do we make her less vulnerable while she's nesting and brooding.
right. And then the one, you carry that a step further and then you think about, well, there's a lot of these nest losses that we're chalking up to predation that were in fact scavenging because that
Yeah,
hen
and
was
Brett
already
said, yeah,
yeah, because that
I was
hen
gonna,
was already run off the nest, best case scenario, and so the eggs wouldn't have hatched anyway. They
yeah,
weren't getting incubated, or worst
she,
case
yeah,
scenario, she had been killed.
yeah. So she's left the nest or died, and the nest is no longer protected. And Brett said that he's been working a lot on that issue,
Hmm.
and it may not have resonated with people during the episode because he did not elaborate on it. But as soon as we turned the microphones off, he then said, "Hey guys, I really need to come talk about predation," and we were like, "Go on,
Hmm.
please."
Right.
And then he made it more clear and really changed the way I was thinking about things when he elaborated on why he wanted to come back. And
Hmm.
that was exactly what you just said, that we have been chalking things up to nest predation
Hmm.
that in fact were either a hen predation or a hen abandonment, and then the eggs got scavenged.
Right.
So then you can trap all the nest predators you want. And if you're not addressing that other issue that's getting the hen killed or the reason she's abandoning it, it will not matter. And
So what you're
he
telling me,
also,
Marcus, is I need to trap coyotes and bobcats too, right?
I'm not going to take a stance on that. I wanna see what Brett has to say about that because he's
Right.
working on it a lot. But we aren't thinking about those predators.
Hmm.
So whether or not that to address it, we're doing habitat stuff or trapping or whatever is irrelevant. We haven't even been thinking about the hen like we have the nest. And now Brett wants to come on and tell us about his work, which to me kind of opened my eyes on how much we could have been missing the nest
Yeah.
predation
Yeah.
part.
And I'm definitely guilty of that as well. And the first time I ever had that conversation with Brett, he was actually on one of my graduate students committees, who finished up relatively recently, Mariah McGinnis, and she did a big artificial turkey nest study on Talladega National Forest. And I made a social media post about it a while back where we had some really cool high resolution video over a couple of
Mhm.
those nests, one in which a gray fox took some eggs, and one in which a coyote took some
I
eggs.
remember that was
And
really
yeah,
good.
and kind of one of my points on that was if you're a manager that's trying to trap to benefit turkey nest success and you're limiting yourself only to like dog proof traps, right? You're going to be missing out on this suite of predators that are also taking nest. But after those conversations with Brett, what I realized is those predators, yeah, maybe they are taking some eggs, but they're only taking those coincident to already having depredated the hen,
Mhm.
you know?
In which
And
case they were already doomed.
yeah,
The eggs were doomed anyway, and then the hen has the disproportionate effect of her whole lifetime of egg laying and
right.
recruiting turkeys is gone.
Sure. And that's one of the things
Yeah.
that we talked about quite a bit in our episode series on, predators and predation is proximate causes of death, or in this
Mhm.
case, egg loss, nest loss, versus ultimate causes. It looks like, species X was responsible. Let's say a possum in one case was responsible for depredating that nest, but the reality was what ultimately happened is maybe, just to use an exotic example, an eagle. Let's say an eagle came along and killed the hen the day before,
Mhm.
so that nest,
W
that
yeah,
that
no
egg was lost either way. It really wasn't the possum's fault.
yeah, and the data set, you would have chalked that nest up to a loss, and then you have evidence of a raccoon or possum or something getting it, and then that
Right.
would have gotten counted as a nest depredation.
Yeah, and the challenge is trying to tease those things out, because a
Yeah.
lot of times if you lose a hen or she abandons a nest, another predator comes in and sucks up those eggs,
Mhm.
relatively quickly afterwards. So it's
Yeah.
difficult to tease that out when you're just looking at dots on a map, right?
Yep.
Those
Yeah.
coordinates that we get from the GPS transmitters.
Yeah, really difficult to to figure out what is actually driving that failure.
Right. Because another thing
So
that Brett has mentioned to me in the past, and I think I've talked to Mike Chamberlain about it too, or maybe just saw it on one of his social media posts, is that hens are pretty damn good at defending nests against raccoon and
yeah.
possum sized predators.
Well, I was gonna bring up, I posted a video that one of the viewers had, that was watching some of my stuff. He was like, "Hey, check out this footage I got. I bumped a nest off the or bumped a nest. I bumped a hen off of her nest on accident. I just happened to have a trail camera, and he put up the trail camera and asked me. He was basically asking, "Is she going to come back?" I said, "Who knows?" But he just went on and put the camera up, and then he got just some remarkable footage
Hmm.
of this hen defending her nest from a
Yeah,
possum.
yeah.
It just I mean, it was like every night the
Is
possum
that?
was in there and she just kept on. She was literally going into full strut,
Yeah,
and then
that's the
she
one you sent me.
hatched
I
out
remember that. Yeah,
she hatched out her poults, and then she was defending those from him, but she did that for a couple weeks as far as I could tell,
yeah.
and she still pulled that thing off. Now, it was not in a place that I would, think is particularly good to nest in,
Hmm.
but the footage was great, and it really resonated with me that I don't really understand what's going on with that hen at that nest. Like,
Yeah,
that was when it was clear to me. It's like, "Oh, I was just kind of under the impression that possum shows up and he's gonna get those eggs."
yeah. She
And
just
it's like,
walks
"No."
away and it's a done deal.
It's like, "No, she was in full strut about to whip his ass,"
Yeah,
and repeatedly, and I just was blown away by that.
right.
Um Yeah, and it's been one of my most popular things on Instagram that I've ever posted, and I asked the guy that sent it to me if he'd mind, and tagged him in
Yeah,
it, but to me, it was just a remarkable. view of how strong that mama is.
Mm-hmm.
But then let's just take a step back. Let's say we put her in that same scenario, but a coyote shows up. She might still try to wean him off, but he's just going to eat her.
Yeah.
You know, so that's an interesting line of thought. It's not from the trapping standpoint. If we borrow some of your work and work of others on trapping coyotes, I don't know that trapping is necessarily going to be the answer in that circumstance either.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting fodder to think about, and we're going to have Brett come back on to tell us about this work that he's doing and trying to get at that problem with misassigning nest fate and all that. But man, that really changed. It shook me a little bit, we'll say.
You were
You
shook.
like if you've ever sat on a turkey, and you're trying to get that turkey to come in, and then one snuck in
Mm-hmm.
behind you,
Yeah.
and then he gobbles in your pocket before you even know he's there.
Yeah.
You know how that shakes you?
Yeah. It's the most opposite competing
Yeah,
reactions that you could possibly have bottled
that
into a second.
yeah, that's the way I felt. It was very
Yeah.
similar. That's one of the things I've been having so much fun with this. I hope the listeners out there are having fun with it, but there've been a bunch of those kinds of instances where something was said or I stumbled across something and it shook me.
Yeah.
And it's the same kind of feeling you get like we just described with that turkey sneaking in on you.
Right.
And man, that's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Getting challenged
Absolutely.
over and over. Okay,
So
go ahead.
you want to go ahead, or you want me to
Well, I
drop
got a
another
big
point?
one.
You got
I
a
got
big
a
one?
big one.
Well,
But you
I'm
could go.
excited.
You get your point in first.
Well, one of the things that was just kind of circling back to the real topic for today, density dependence.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that stood out to me that Mark shared was, how much documentation there is of density dependence in quail populations.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, on some of these properties now where they're pushing quail to densities that probably have never been present on the landscape in recorded history. They've started to see that that nesting attempts decline from like a normal year, like 80% of your quail hens attempt to nest, to a year following a really high density fall population that may go down to like 60%
Mm-hmm.
of your hens attempt to nest, so a 20% decrease. And then he pointed out that there was a paper. It was published in a relatively small state level journal in Georgia. The lead author on that was Bobby Bond. I think I'm pretty sure he's a WMA manager in
Mm-hmm.
Georgia. And then I know Kevin Lowry was also on there. He was the state turkey coordinator for Georgia for a while. He may still be. Another really good biologist. They put out this paper that documented that poult per hen ratios were decreasing when the breeding bird survey data, those point counts that are conducted on that
Mm-hmm.
same survey route year after year, this kind of a crowdsourced data set, were increasing. So
Yeah.
as overall
So is that?
turkey abundance goes up, as indexed by gobbling, poult per hen ratios go down, which is
Yeah.
indicative of density dependence. And
Yeah.
I dug a little bit deeper into that study, and it
Mm-hmm.
was 30 years of data. The poult per hen data were collected, of course, by the state during their brood surveys. So it was independent from the breeding bird survey data, which goes back 30 years and even further than that if you wanted to. And they documented that for turkeys. And in fact, I don't know if you got a chance to look at the paper, but the R
I didn't.
squared value, the R squared value on that relationship was 0.64,
Mm.
which is an indicator of a really high degree of correlation. It basically means that 64% of the variation in your response variable, which in this case would be poult per hen ratios, is attributable to your X variable, which in this case was the breeding bird survey data.
Yeah. It's pretty common in nature. If we get up above about 0.4, we're
Yeah,
getting pretty tickled about it.
we get excited.
Yeah.
So
We get a little
0.64.
shook.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. That I kind of ended up in a different realm of my literature review following on these, and I didn't look at that, but that's really interesting. So again, that may not be strong in terms of direct application, but it does make me want to think of what might be the mechanism there.
Yeah, we
And,
still don't, that's the key point. We still don't know what that is.
And what it's acting on. But the other thing that you brought up actually segues in to something I've been thinking about for a while that I feel like I have not been articulating very clearly, and maybe people have surmised what I'm getting at with it, but I have not just been real direct about it. But you brought up the quail example and how some of the hens will just not they just don't put any effort into the reproduction.
Yeah.
And it's a density dependent response, and that's in the east, right? There's a lot of rainfall. It's and they don't even know what is the mechanism. Like, what's the cue that's causing the hen? Whether it be reproductive condition or body condition or whatever, or
it could even be
there's
pheromones, right?
Yeah, there's not space. There's pheromones. I don't know. I have no idea. And Mark could come in here and say, we just figured out that it's X, Y, Z, whatever. And
density
I would
stress.
Yeah, I have no idea. Like, I don't know what is causing that, but it was kind of remarkable to me. And then linking that to what Brett said with the turkey population in Texas and the fact that hens, they just don't put any effort into reproduction when it's dry, during drought. So then it got me really bouncing around some things about that. And I just wanted to be, and folks that listen to that episode heard me kind of push a narrative toward him and see how he responded about this. And I have done the same with Chamberlain one time. To me, the Texas population is a remarkable example of how important habitat is.
Yeah.
Everybody wants to say it's rainfall driven, and that's fine. It is. But what is rainfall driving? Rainfall is driving the availability of forbs, which are really critical for brooding success. And Brett said it, and I've heard others talk about it. When it has rained and you have a foreblend, I'm going to coin that term, foreblend. You need it.
Consider it
If you're
coined.
a turkey, if you want turkeys, you need some foreblend. But the turkeys is literally like they're just coming out of the cracks. They're like, rolling in with tumbleweeds or something. I don't know, but we got the turkeys, like they can't fail basically when it rains. And then in the years when it doesn't rain, productivity goes to near zero.
Right.
You have very few hens nest, like they just don't even attempt. And then are relatively few I don't know what the number is exactly, but fewer hens actually attempt nesting. And then those nests are less successful and the poults are less successful. And you get this, basically failure. And then he was talking about it being so important for the hen survival to make it multiple years so that she's alive when the really good opportunity comes. But I started thinking about that from a different point of view and how that really is a shining example to me of the importance that habitat plays in determining productivity. And everybody is quick to caveat that the East is different than the West because theirs is rainfall. That's just a limiting resource. What is limiting forbs? And it happens to be broad scale. They got plenty of sunlight.
Yeah.
But water is driving it. In the East, it is sunlight. And if we have a landscape that is limited by sunlight, why would we not expect the same problem at a landscape scale in reproduction? No one has articulated a counter to that I have moved on it. To me, Texas, it happens to be a different limiting resource.
Right.
It's water, not sunlight. But in the East, it's sunlight, and think about how much the landscape has changed, how much denser forests are than they were. Like when Bartram was talking about it, like there weren't any trees. It was all open. burned landscape. And a lot of our openings now are in something that's not a plant community that will support poult rearing in particular. But to me, that's a really striking example of the role of habitat. Now, the other thing I found particularly interesting with that, and this is probably what's going to ruffle some feathers, we'll say. I got curious about what about predator populations? Is that confounded?
Mm.
When we have a drought in Texas, do all the predator populations crash? And then that would be indicative that maybe it's not uh, just driven by habitat. But then I started thinking, well, actually, then we would expect it to be the opposite because I would expect there to be more predators when there was more water. And then you'd have highest success of the hens and poults when there was the
And
most predators.
unless
Yeah,
there was some kind of lag phase built in there where turkey
yeah,
populations were able to respond to increased precipitation faster than
right.
predator populations were.
Yeah, yeah, you're exactly right. It was right there with you. So I started digging around, trying to figure out what are the predator populations. And then I was like, well, hell, which predators do I need to care about? So I
Mhm.
went and I found some of Brett's work that he led with some graduate students, from what I can tell, uh, figuring out what the major predators were.
Mhm.
And of course, it was the same culprits as usual. It was raccoons, and the study I found was nest predation. Gray foxes were on the list. I think bobcats, or what do they have? Uh, the big cat. I can't think of the name of the ocelot. So they had some predators like that as well that I figured might be important for the
Mhm.
hens at least. So I went through and started digging around, and I found some studies on predator populations over time, and presumably because of the length of the time with several of those, they would be subjected to periodic drought.
Mhm.
And it was pretty remarkable to me that the populations remained stable. Like
Mm.
even raccoons, the population was stable. And I actually stumbled across a study that was done in Florida, which it rains plenty here, but we do still have some droughts, and it was in the Sandhill region here
Where
that,
things dry out more
yeah,
quickly.
it's really, really droughty.
Yeah.
Uh, and they actually found in that long term study, they were specifically trying to look at moisture, rainfall relationships with raccoons and possums. And the possums actually, they did have a measurable effect of the rainfall.
Mhm.
But raccoons their lambda stayed almost 1, which means it's stable.
Mhm.
It almost did not well, I think actually statistically, it was never different than 1 for the entirety of the study, even though there was wide variation in the amount of rainfall. So, all that to say, the predator populations, and they made a point in that paper that a lot of these predators, especially the bigger predators, if their adult survival is high, the population stays relatively stable through those kinds of stochastic events.
Mhm.
And that's how they explain the possums. They're more short-lived, rapid reproduction, and they were a little more sensitive to that.
Mhm.
But the raccoons, they did not fluctuate to it. And the Texas study actually that I keyed in on, it was in a population of raccoons that were protected, so the adult mortality was relatively low, and that population remained really stable through drought.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting stuff, and I mean, I think that's, more I think that's more evidence that suggests that we need to be looking really hard at habitat. And I don't think anyone's disagreed with that. I mean,
Mm-mm.
even Brett, and I bring Brett up because, both he and Mike really talk about the importance of harvest and these dynamics that we're seeing right now. Um, and when they even though they discuss that and that's the main focus of their discussion, they acknowledge that in
Well, even
most
take home
places,
points of it, yeah.
yeah, they say take home points, or that more turkey habitat would be a great thing not only for turkeys but for a lot of our species
Yeah.
throughout the southeast, many of which are in decline that are dependent on some of these early successional habitats. But I think the reason that they keep the two of them, and I don't want to speak for them, but I think I've listened to enough of their
Mhm.
content to have my head around this pretty good, is the reason that they circle back more towards regulating harvest and season frameworks is that they feel like we don't have as much control over habitat.
Mm.
And
Yeah, at
Brett,
least at a statewide level,
yeah,
I'm with him.
sure, absolutely, and Brett, he even mentioned that he has some belief that we've already kind of done a lot of, put a lot of effort into that, done almost as much as we can do with trying to restore turkey habitat on the ground. And that's one area where I just would have to disagree, because and it's probably because I focus so much on habitat as
Mhm.
part of my job, and I'm all into forest management for wildlife. That's one of the key aspects of my research program. But you and I both have gone out on many turkey centric properties, where turkeys are the number one management objectives, and still seeing poor, example after example of poor turkey habitat.
Mhm.
And a lot of times these people are putting a lot of effort and money into the property. It's just they don't know how to properly allocate that.
Right, and they're seeking help to do so.
Sure. So I think that there's still a lot of willingness
Mhm.
and a lot of space to improve turkey habitat in these areas where the populations are declining.
Yeah. Well, and, I'll lean back on the statement earlier. I don't I think it was kinda silly to think that habitat is the only thing that matters.
Yeah.
That's not the only lever
Right.
to pull.
Right.
But I'm with you. I think that we are in a landscape from a turkey standpoint, we are in a landscape that is patchy and spotty at best, particularly for, things that are really important for reproduction, like poult rearing cover or even nesting cover. Like that's relatively uh, sparse at a landscape scale,
Mhm.
and definitely not well connected. And I think that is the important point, and it is very difficult to organize. I mean, think about how many people have to pull the same lever to have a corridor
Yeah.
of that on the landscape. I mean, that's very difficult as opposed to a season, then you have a centralized entity that can potentially pull that lever. So there's definitely differences in how you might accomplish those things. But if you think about the landscape and what all has changed just in the past 25, 30 years, I could definitely see habitat playing a big time role.
Mhm.
And with the changes that we've actually seen during that time period, not only do we have the urban sprawl, more people, more development, all that kind of stuff, less connectivity, more roads, all those sorts of things. Not only all of that, but you then think about some of the widespread practices that were implemented, like the real shift in the landscape to live pine plantation. A lot of that stuff occurred during the 90s. Well, when would it get to basically an unusable the unusable time frame in that without other intervention? Essentially, when all the turkey decline stuff started, right?
Yeah.
And that's a huge part of the landscape in the eastern subpopulation that's specific to that population that is pretty consistent across a bunch of states.
Yeah,
The
I mean,
Pine Belt.
in the Southeast specifically, like you just mentioned, the
Yeah.
Pine Belt, we look at the conservation reserve program and all, for all the good it did. A lot of people planted agriculture back to pine plantation, and when you look at, if you understand the relationship between pine plantation age and suitability or wildlife habitat quality, particularly for species like turkeys,
Mhm.
that decline perfectly coincides with when those plantations started to become closed canopy, barren understory, And what made it even worse, and this is a conversation that I had with John Grucci, a while back, who's a terrific private lands biologist in Mississippi, is that like once those trees started maturing, it's not saying that pine plantations are bad for turkeys. It's pine plantations that become closed canopy monocultures are bad for turkeys, and now people are having a hard time getting those stands harvested.
Moving wood. Yeah.
Thinned or otherwise, because prices are so low. There's not as many loggers out
Mm-hmm.
there. The loggers have their pick of sites, so they're only choosing the sites that are the easiest to operate on.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this whole culmination of factors that are affecting habitat kind of over this time span that we're talking about here.
Yeah. Let me throw another nugget in there, if I may. We're also talking about a time when, and then let's say during the 80s, if you went out in an agricultural field, that thing would have been pretty weedy.
hmm Didn't have
So
nearly
not
the herbicide options we have now.
right. So you might have a foreblend
hmm
that does pretty good producing some turkeys by accident. It's
Yeah,
not the purpose of it, but it still accomplishes it.
yeah,
Uh, and you fast forward, from the mid 80s to the mid 90s, all of a sudden, not only have we implemented a program that's converting a lot of uh, that stuff that would produce some poles into something that, at least down the road pretty quickly, will not.
hmm
But we also converted the other parts of that agriculture to Roundup Ready, much more now really rich herbicide opportunity to keep it relatively clean, and
hmm
that is less conducive to poult rearing as well. So now think about that landscape change. Now
And
it's
what?
not just about pine trees. We've got multiple land use changes in synchrony,
Yeah,
and the Roundup one. I'm saying Roundup, but it's the herbicide revolution. Well, or one. I guess there have been several herbicide revolutions, but that one was a revolution
yeah, sure.
uh, in its own right. That really changed the way that agriculture was going in a way that is probably negative for turkeys and quail and other species that like that same kind of structure for
And
part of
then
their life cycle.
and then if I may, you compound that with other problems that were increasing over the same time period. We have increasing feral pig populations. We
Mhm.
have introduction of new diseases or increased prevalence of those
Mhm.
diseases. And you have over that time period, and this was a point that Brett was very keen to make, is a turkey hunter population and a harvest pressure put on that population that had never been witnessed before.
Mhm.
Coinciding with
Well,
that
yeah,
peak.
now we're articulating why it's probably, we have competing hypotheses, but the reality is they're just like different aspects of the same hypothesis.
Sure, sure.
Because they're I mean, I have very little question in my mind that some combination of those factors are interacting, and they're probably interacting with different relative importance depending on where
Yeah.
you're at. But all of those, I would assume, have to be important factors.
And this circles right back to a key point that Coulter made early in our conversation, was that there's too much work to do on turkeys for a small group of people to complete it, because some of these hypotheses that we talked about today, they could take an entire 30-year career for one of us to
Hmm.
try to thoroughly investigate that hypothesis.
Yeah. Well,
So
and
I
then
mean
you're
that.
gonna, you're gonna not, if you're not challenged in that, then you're gonna have a way that you think about things, and there's a lot of value in us challenging each other.
hmm Yeah, I mean, and if you've spent 15 years and 4 or 5 research projects investigating that hypothesis, your fifth or sixth research project is probably going to still be focused on that, because
Hmm.
why would I want to shift from I have 4 or 5 of these projects that have been habitat centric on turkeys, and I already know so much about that. My data set has been building on itself over time, and now I'm just not going to go over here and start looking at feral pig impacts or disease impacts.
Hmm.
And that's why I think it's a good time to be in turkey research, because we've got so many people willing to put money into it, and a diversity of people working on it, and a diversity of geographic areas.
Yeah, a lot of great scientists with very different skill sets and mindsets and experience. I
Yeah.
think there's a lot of value in having people that are all in on turkeys and never do anything else. And there also is a lot of value in people that work on a bunch of systems and a bunch of different kinds of species because of how that influences perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
I think, we're in a great time for that. And hopefully we're going to cover a lot of that work right here. So people, have this as their hub to have access to that information, and
Yeah.
really, really exciting.
Yeah. And I mean, I know we say this all the time, but it's because it's true. The more people share this, share this with your friends, anybody that you
Hmm.
know that's interested in turkey hunting, or, maybe even a biologist that or, um, anybody that that might that might give us a listen.
Yeah,
And for you also to subscribe and leave us a review. Let us know
yeah,
what you think. Let us know what we can do better, and that's going to help spread the word and
right.
continue to get more people involved to finding solutions.
Yeah. Well, ultimately, this is about the resource, and we're trying to do our part. And I think it's intuitive for folks, that listening to it and then sharing it with their friends or family or whatever helps us spread the word. But the algorithm that is working behind the scenes at Apple or wherever, it's determining whether or not people like it based on that rating or that
Hmm.
review that you leave. So that's really important too, because they start presenting this as an option for people that listen to similar types of content. And if we really want, especially with something like habitat, if we really want to impact it at the landscape scale, it's going to take getting this kind of information to the people that are in control of that. And
Yeah.
that's where our audience really comes in. And I for one have been really overwhelmed with the support, and thank you all for listening and helping us with that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's what its intended use is at the end of the day, right? And we
Yeah.
just have to play by the rules that are set forth by these, organizations that help us publish it. So
Yep,
we
exactly.
have to play their game.
Yep. So we need your likes and reviews and ratings and all that stuff. And thanks everybody for listening and helping us do that. Hopefully this will benefit wild turkeys.
Yeah. That review you leave is not to benefit us, it's to benefit turkeys. So leave a
Yeah.
review for the turkeys, right?
Review for the turkeys. That's a good one. All right. Well, I for one think that was a great episode, a great recap of that, and we got to talk about some things that we needed to get off our chest. At least I did.
Yeah.
And
Uh,
thanks
I have no
everybody out there.
Yeah, and I have no doubt we're gonna circle back to this one multiple times
Oh yeah,
again in the future.
we'll be back, and we're gonna have those guys back too. And we got several other really good people, good scientists lined up. So I'm excited to see where this goes. And folks out there, if y'all have a topic that you didn't understand or that you want us to cover, or somebody you want us to seek out or have back, let us know.
Yeah. You can reach us on social media. I'm primarily active on Instagram, and that's at Doctor, which is Dr_Will_Gulsby, Gulsby. And Marcus is at DrDisturbance. Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.